This is Social Studies, Chapter 8, Lesson 4, and it kind of continues what we were talking about in Lesson 3 because we're still talking about the history of the Southwest region and how it's changed and grown over time. So our title here is Growth of the Southwest. On page 274 at the top, we've got a picture of some cowboys, and it says, people today continue to practice the skills that some of the first cowboys used. And a lot of times they do that through competing in rodeos. But you've got these cowboys here chasing these horses, and there's a question that asks, what do you think they're doing? Well, you can see they've got these lassos above their head, and they're trying to rope or catch these horses that are running there. And then there's a picture of Stephen F. Austin on this page, which you'll read about as one of the first American settlers to come to the Texas area. So why don't you pause the video and read this page, and then we'll talk about what was on this page. Okay, so on this page, the first paragraph talks about the Alamo, which is something you may or may not have heard of. It was a Spanish mission, and we talked about Spanish missions in the last lesson. And it's still, part of it at least, is still standing in San Antonio, Texas. And it's something that's talked about a lot. You may have heard there's a quote that says, "Remember the Alamo." That's said, in different movies and in different contexts because it was a big battle when Texas was trying to get away from Mexico. They didn't want to be part of Mexico anymore. And the Texans actually lost that battle, and many Texas soldiers were killed. So Mexico won that battle of that war, but ended up losing the war ultimately, and so they lost possession of Texas. So it says in 1821, this Stephen F. Austin, like we talked about in the picture, led a group of American settlers into Texas. So they came from the east and moved into Texas, but at this time it was still part of Mexico. And so, there was a lot of American settlers that came to this area of Texas because there was a lot of good farmland that they could buy up and build settlements on. And then it says over time, since there's so many of these American settlers that have moved in, they didn't want to be part of Mexico anymore. So they declared their independence from Mexico and ended up having to fight a war in order to earn that independence. And so for a while there, once they won that war, Texas was its own country. And they soon kind of found that, they didn't want to be their own country and rule being so small. So they asked to become part of the United States. And so it says in 1845 they were annexed or added to the United States because so many of those settlers that lived there now were from the United States anyway. And Mexico didn't like the fact that they joined the United States, so that started the Mexican-American War, which the United States won. And at the end of that war, part of the terms were we also earned some of New Mexico and Arizona, so we gained even more land after that. We go on to the next page here, and it's going to talk about how once we gained this land, we now have Texas, Arizona, New Mexico as part of the United States. How did that affect the Native Americans that lived there when people started to move into the area? So why don't you pause, read this page, and then we'll talk about it. So like it says at the top here, now that we own this land, it says settlers started to pour into this area. It was new territory to explore. So more and more people started coming there. And, because a lot of this, at least the southern part of Arizona and New Mexico was deserty area, people tended to stay away from those areas but settle more in the river valleys, which happened to also be a lot of the same places where these Native American villages were because they used the river for travel, for a water source, for irrigation for their crops. And so there was conflict there. And we've seen this pattern in several of our other different regions where when American settlers came in and the Native Americans were on land that they wanted, they essentially took it from them and forced them to go somewhere else. And that happened down in the Southwest as well. They forced a lot of the Navajo Native Americans to move out of the area so that they could take over their land and move them to reservations. One big one was in Oklahoma. And then some of the land that was taken was, like it said, eventually given back to them. And there are large reservations still today in Arizona, New Mexico, where a lot of these Navajo ancestors of those groups do still live in that same area. And there's a picture of some of the members of the Navajo Nation today, it says. So we've got a question number 1 here that says, how did the desire for land in the Southwest lead to fighting? Well, like it says on this page, Americans took land that belonged to Native Americans first. And that caused an awful lot of conflict. Now on the next page, we're going to fast forward a little bit here. And we've got lots of people that have settled in Texas. And one big industry there is farming and ranching. And in Texas, when on their ranches, they raise a lot of cattle. And so go ahead and read this page, and then we'll talk about what it said here. Okay, so on this page, it talked about how people raise cattle on their ranches, and they raise those cattle for beef. But if you look at the map, this is a map of during that time, you can see that none of the railroad lines came down into Texas. When the first railroad lines that they built went kind of straight through the middle of the country, so they were centrally located. And so if they were going to get these cattle to meat packing plants in larger cities, a lot of them were up north because some of this territory was newer territory. They didn't have these established large cities with these meat packing plants and factories down in this area yet. And so in order to get to some of these meat packing plants further in the north, these cowboys would go on these long cattle drives. And we had a story about this in one of our Scholastic News a while back, and I don't remember if Nat Love, if he was the cowboy that was in that story or not. I can't remember. But here's a picture of one cowboy, and like it said in our Scholastic News too, a lot of them were African American cowboys, that this was the only job that they could find. And it was a hard work, and they had to travel long distances. You can see these orange lines on the map are their cattle trails that they would travel, and these cowboys would ride horses and push the cattle north until they would get to a railroad line, and then they would put them in the railroad cars, which would take them to the cities, to the meat packing plants. So number 2 on this page says, on the map, mark a route for a cattle drive. Go from southern Texas to a railroad stop. So you can pick whichever one you want. As long as you start in the southern part of Texas, just follow one of those cattle trails all the way up until you get to one of the railroad cities where they would load them onto the railroad cars. Now on the next page it talks a little bit more about the ranches, and then it talks about the oil industry there, which is also big. So go ahead and pause the video and read this page, and then we'll talk a little bit about this page. Okay, so on this page, it talked about the fact that cattle ranching and the beef industry was very big down in Texas, but it changed over time because once more railroads started to be built down into that area, they didn't have the need for long cattle drives and these cow hands to take them there. And when more and more cities and roads started being built, that's when you ended up with fenced in fields. Before, they weren't like that. They could just travel, along the prairie, and they didn't run into any fences in their way. Well, as people start buying land, they're putting up fences around their property, and the cattle can't roam freely like they used to. And so they no longer needed these cattle drives because there were railroads accessible going right through Texas and the Southwest now. Then there was a big discovery made in Texas. In Spindletop was the name of the town. They discovered oil there. And I think we also had a story about this. Can't remember if it was in our reading book, where, they're this down in this area, there were some scientists who were just sure that they would be able to find oil in this area. And so they continued to drill, and one day in Spindletop, they struck it big, and you have what's called a gusher, where you can see in this picture, it's just a stream of it gushing into the air. And it says it took them 9 days to stop this from gushing out like that to where they could get it under control. And so once they discovered this large amount of oil underneath Texas here and going out into the Gulf of Mexico, now all these oil derricks are popping up, which is what you see in the picture there. And people started to flock to the area. Everybody wanted in on this and wanted to get a part of it because, striking oil is kind of like finding gold. It's worth a lot of money. And so, it says originally to buy land in Spindletop, you could buy it for $150. Well, now that we know there's oil on it, the price goes up. The land's more expensive to $50,000 for one lot, because that oil underneath makes it that much more valuable. So if there were people living there that already owned land, they could make a lot of money off the oil companies because they would be willing to pay a lot of money to let them dig or drill for oil on their land. And still today, the oil industry is big down in Texas. So number 3 says, write a conclusion about how land might be used near an oil field. So the oil field would be where they drill for the oil. So the land around it, for thinking, there's probably going to be a town with homes and, businesses for the workers of the oil field, because they're going to need somewhere to live. And then if there's homes there, well, then they're going to need a grocery store, and so these towns would pop up, just like we talked about boom towns with gold rushes. Same thing happened when oil was discovered. Okay. Then on to the next page. It talks about the fact that the Southwest region is still growing today. So why don't you go ahead and pause it and read this page, and then we'll talk about it. So it says, parts of the Southwest, there's still kind of some wide open space there, especially in the deserty area. There's lots of spaces where that still haven't been developed because it's a deserty area. Parts of Texas are still wide open, where you've got lots of farms and ranches, but that doesn't mean there's no big cities there, because there are. It says 4 of the fastest growing cities in the United States are in the Southwest: Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, and Phoenix. And so, you've got that city plus all of its suburbs around it, and they just continue to grow and grow down there because they've got lots of opportunities for, it says, service industries, high-tech industries, medical industries. And so just like we've seen in other regions, those types of industries have started to grow in these cities as well. Then you've also got the population of what we call snowbirds, which some of us, or a lot of us, probably know someone who from Minnesota or somewhere up here north during the winter have another home or somewhere, an apartment that they rent down there, and go stay in Arizona or somewhere in the Southwest for the winter so they don't have to deal with the cold and the snow, and then they come back home to Minnesota for the summer. There's a large population of people that do that in Arizona, just like in Florida, like we talked about in the Southeast. And then, we've got populations that retire there too. Once they retire, they just move down there for good because they want to be in the warm weather all the time. And it also brings lots of tourists to the area for different reasons, like we talked about. So we've got a couple pictures here on this page. It says there's lots of job opportunities like construction, because if people are going to continue to move there, they're going to need to build more homes and businesses. And then it says, they've got a picture of the Phoenix skyline here. It says the area around Phoenix is called the Valley of the Sun because it's so nice and warm there. Then on the last page here, we've got a chart to finish filling out. For number 4, it says compare the reasons these people settled in the Southwest. So it says the early American settlers came for land, the homesteaders came to start farms, oil workers came to find and sell oil, and retired people come for the warm weather and maybe some of the scenery. So your job then will be to answer number 5 and 6 here on this page. Number 5 says write a conclusion about how railroads changed cattle ranching. So talk about maybe the difference between what was it like before the railroads came to the Southwest, and then once they did come to the Southwest, how did that change ranching? Then number 6, what cultures influence the history of the area where you live? Write a description of a talk you could give to tourists. This one, I remember typically I would go through this one with the students. And so if you want to listen and write down what I have to say, or if you have another idea. But we would usually talk about the fact that Minnesota has such a large Norwegian population, people from Norway, which is part of Europe. And that's where we get the name for our Vikings football team, why that's such a big deal. And so our big culture would be Norwegian. And then it says write a description of a talk you could give to tourists. Well, you could maybe take tourists through US Bank Stadium and talk about the Vikings and where that name came from because of the fact that Minnesota has such a large Norwegian population. So if that's something you want to put down, you can go ahead and put that down. Or if you have another idea, you could use that also.